The morning Wallace Mercer painted Charlotte Hart's name on the old wooden water trough at the edge of Main Street. Every soul in Millhaven, Texas knew about it before Charlotte had even finished braiding her hair. It was the spring of 1878, and Millhaven sat stubborn and sun-baked along the edge of the Llano Estacado, the kind of town that had grown up fast around a railroad spur and a handful of stubborn dreams. The streets were wide enough for two wagons to pass without a quarrel. The saloon was louder than the church on most Sundays, and everybody knew everybody else's business whether they wanted to or not. The water trough on Main Street was the very center of that universe. Every horse in the county drank from it, every rider passed it, and every woman fetching dry goods from Hargrove's general store had to walk directly by it. It was, in other words, the single worst possible place in all of Millhaven for a lovesick cowboy to make a declaration, and Wallace Mercer had done it anyway. He had risen before the sun, slipped into town in the blue-gray hour before dawn, with a pot of bright red paint left over from when Hector Crane had repainted his livery stable the previous autumn. Wallace had knelt in the dirt beside that trough, his broad shoulders hunched and careful, his thick fingers wrapped around a brush that was far too wide for the letters he was trying to form. He was not a man of delicate movements. He rode hard, roped fast, and had hands that were more accustomed to saddle leather than to paint brushes. But he had taken his time that morning. He had painted each letter slow and deliberate, pressing his tongue against the inside of his cheek in concentration. Charlotte, and beneath it, in letters slightly smaller but no less red, Sheisthone. He had stepped back, looked at his work in the gray pre-dawn light, and felt something crack open in his chest like a door blowing wide in a storm. Then he had turned, walked back to his horse, and ridden the 3 miles out to the Callaway Ranch where he had been employed as a hand for the better part of 2 years. By 7 in the morning, Edna Pruitt had seen it on her way to the post office and told Reverend Marsh. By 7:30, Reverend Marsh's wife had told 4 women in the church garden. By 8, Hector Crane was telling every man who brought a horse to his livery, and by 8:30, young Tommy Wills, who swept the floors at Hargrove's general store, had told Mr. Hargrove himself, who was Charlotte Hart's employer. Charlotte herself was in the back storeroom of Hargrove's, inventorying a new shipment of canned peaches and bolts of calico, entirely unaware that her name had been painted in the boldest red letters the town had ever seen on the most public piece of property in Millhaven. She was 24 years old that spring. With dark brown hair she wore in a practical braid most days, and a pair of gray-green eyes that had a way of looking at things with a precision that made most people feel they were being read like a book. She had come to Millhaven 3 years earlier from a small farm outside of San Antonio, following her older brother James, who had set up a small law practice in town. James was good with words on paper. Charlotte was good with words in the air, and she was equally good with numbers, which was why Edwin Hargrove had hired her as his store manager rather than as a simple shop girl. She ran his inventory, handled his accounts, and kept the peace between the ranch hands who came in smelling of cattle and the finer ladies of the town, who came in expecting to be treated as though they were shopping in Galveston. She was sensible and practical and not given to melodrama, which made what happened next all the more entertaining to everyone who witnessed it. "Miss Hart," Edwin Hargrove said, appearing in the doorway of the storeroom with his eyebrows raised so high they had nearly disappeared into his hairline. "When you have a moment, there is something out front you ought to see." Charlotte set down her ledger and followed him through the store, past the glass counter with the jars of hard candy and the bolts of cloth stacked in their neat rows, and out through the front door into the bright Texas morning. She saw the trough. She saw the paint. She read the words. She read them again. The color that came into her face started at the collar of her blouse and moved upward with the slow, unstoppable progress of a spring flood, until her cheeks were nearly the same shade as the letters. Around her, she became slowly aware that several people on the street had stopped what they were doing. Mrs. Prout was watching from the doorway of the post office with the expression of a woman at the theater. Two cowboys she did not recognize were grinning at each other over their horses' backs. Little Tommy Wills had followed her outside and was watching with his mouth open. "Who," Charlotte said, in a voice that she worked very hard to keep level, "did this?" Silence. Then Tommy, who had no sense of self-preservation whatsoever, said cheerfully, "Wallace Mercer, Miss Hart. Everybody knows." Charlotte turned around, walked back into the store, picked up her ledger, and returned to the canned peaches. She sat down on an upturned crate and stared at the ledger without seeing any of it for a very long time. Wallace Mercer. She knew exactly who Wallace Mercer was, which was itself a problem, because she had been trying for the better part of 6 months not to think too much about who Wallace Mercer was. He came into Hargrove's store every few weeks on behalf of the Calloway Ranch, picking up supplies on the ranch's account. He was a tall man, the kind of tall that made doorways seem like they had been designed with someone else in mind, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes beneath the brim of a hat that had seen considerable weather. He did not talk much, and when he did talk, he chose his words with a care that surprised Charlotte every time, because he did not look like a man who would be careful about anything. He looked like a man who rode into things directly and let the consequences sort themselves out. The first time he had come in, she had been helping old Mrs. Calloway herself with a fabric order, and she had glanced up at the tall cowboy waiting at the counter, and immediately looked back down at her fabric samples, because there was something about his eyes when they landed on her that made her feel like she had stepped out of the shade into the full force of a July afternoon. The second time, he had lingered at the counter longer than necessary while she tallied his order, and when she looked up he had said, "You are the most organized person I have ever watched work," which was so unexpected that she had laughed before she could stop herself. That laugh had done something to his face. She had seen it happen. Some tightness around his jaw had softened, and the corner of his mouth had moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to one to count. After that it had become a sort of quiet game between them, one that neither of them had ever named or acknowledged. He came in. She handled his order. They talked just long enough for Charlotte to feel the conversation ending with something unsaid, and then he left. She would watch him through the front window as he loaded the wagon and thought about nothing in particular until he was out of sight, and then she would go back to work and not think about it again. Or she would try not to. And now he had painted her name on the water trough, and the whole town knew before she did, which meant that the quiet, unnamed game they had been playing was finished, and something else was about to begin whether she felt ready for it or not. She closed the ledger, stood up from her crate, and straightened her blouse. It took her until noon to decide what she was going to do about it. What she decided was this. She was going to do nothing about it at all, and she was going to let Wallace Mercer come to her if he had the intention of coming to her, because a man who painted a woman's name on a public water trough had clearly made a decision, and it was not her responsibility to chase after that decision. She was a sensible woman, and she was going to behave as a sensible woman. This resolution lasted until approximately 2 in the afternoon, when she was standing behind the counter tallying a week's worth of receipts, and the bell above the door opened. And she looked up and felt that July afternoon sensation hit her square in the chest. Wallace Mercer walked into Hargrove's general store with his hat in his hands, which she had never seen before. He always wore his hat indoors, the way most of the ranch hands did, with a carelessness about the custom that made the older women of the town cluck their tongues. But today his hat was in his hands, held against his chest in both fists like it was either a shield or an offering, and his dark eyes went directly to her. The store was, at that moment, occupied also by Mrs. Calloway's daughter-in-law Ruth, who was looking at dress fabric with a thoroughness that suggested she was also listening to everything, and by Mr. Hargrove himself, who had found something very pressing to organize on a shelf directly within earshot of the counter. Wallace crossed the floor to the counter and stood in front of Charlotte, and they looked at each other for what felt to Charlotte like a very significant amount of time, but was probably only 4 or 5 seconds. "I came," he said, "to see if you had seen it." "I have seen it," Charlotte said. Her voice was perfectly steady. She was proud of that. He searched her face. She could see him doing it, reading her expression with the same careful attention he gave to distance when he was sighting something on the horizon. "And," he said. And Charlotte said, keeping her voice at the same measured level, "I think you could have chosen a better canvas." Something happened to the line of his mouth. "I did not have paper large enough." She looked at him. The earnestness in his face was going to be the end of her. She could feel it. This large, sun-weathered man standing in a general store with his hat crumpled in his fists, looking at her like she was the most important problem he had ever needed to solve. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I believe there is a proper way to do these things." "I know there is," he said. "I am not always a proper man." From the vicinity of the dress fabric she heard a small sound from Ruth Calloway that might have been suppressed delight. "Would you," Charlotte said carefully, "like to call on me, at my brother's house, in the proper way?" He nodded once, slow and certain, the way he decided most things. "Saturday evening." "Saturday evening," she agreed. He put his hat back on his head, nodded at her once more, and walked out of the store. Charlotte looked down at her receipts and realized she had been pressing the pencil so hard against the ledger that she had dented 3 pages. Behind her, Mr. Hargrove said, with great enthusiasm, "Well, I think that went very well." James Hart was 28 years old and took his responsibilities as Charlotte's older brother with an occasional seriousness that he deployed mostly at inconvenient moments. When Charlotte told him that evening that Wallace Mercer intended to call on Saturday, James put down his book, looked at his sister over the tops of his reading spectacles, and said, "Wallace Mercer, the cowboy who painted your name on the water trough?" "Yes," Charlotte said. "Half the town came by my office today to ask me if I had heard," James said. "What did you tell them?" "I told them that my sister was a grown woman and that I had no opinion on the subject," he said. "Which was not strictly true, because I have several opinions, but I thought it was the correct thing to say." Charlotte sat down across from him. "What are your several opinions?" James considered. "He seems like a decent man. He has worked for the Calloways for 2 years without a whisper of trouble, which is more than can be said for most of the hands that come through here. He is respectful in town. He paid off a debt to Hargrove before it was even due, which Hargrove mentioned to me more than once." He paused. "And any man who does something that publicly foolish in the name of telling a woman he cares about her is either completely sincere or completely insane, and since he does not appear to be insane, I suppose that accounts for itself." Charlotte looked at her hands. "He is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I do not know," she admitted. "I just did not expect him to be so careful about things. He thinks before he speaks. Not many men do." James looked at her in the way that older brothers look at younger sisters when they have realized something before she has realized it herself, and said nothing further on the subject. He simply picked up his book and said, "Tell him to come at 7, and I'll have Mrs. Garza make supper." Saturday arrived with the slow inevitability of something that has been counted down to, and Charlotte spent more time than she would ever admit choosing what to wear. She settled on a dress of soft blue-gray wool that she had made herself the previous winter, which was practical but had enough grace in the cut to suggest she had made some effort, which she had. She wore her hair up, which she rarely did at home, and she sat at the kitchen table at 6:45 and pretended to read a periodical while actually reading the same sentence 17 times. At exactly 7 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. She had expected, in some part of herself that she did not want to examine too closely, that he might be late, or nervous, or awkward on a porch in the way that men who were entirely comfortable on horseback sometimes became awkward when they were required to make conventional social calls. She had expected some gap between the man who could paint her name in red letters large enough for the whole town to read and the man who would stand at her brother's door with hat in hand. There was no gap. He knocked, she opened the door, and he was simply himself, which she was beginning to understand was a fixed and stable thing. He was wearing a clean shirt and his good jacket, and he had clearly made an effort with his boots, and he held a small bunch of bluebonnets that he had clearly cut from somewhere along the road because they were wilting slightly and a bit dirt-streaked and absolutely perfect. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and stepped back to let him in. James came out of the parlor and shook Wallace's hand with a directness that Charlotte knew meant he was being assessed, though James was good enough at it that it looked like simple courtesy. They sat in the parlor while Mrs. Garza finished supper, and James asked Wallace about the Calloway Ranch with the genuine interest of a man who understood land and work, and Wallace answered with a thoughtfulness that Charlotte could see earning her brother's quiet respect. They ate supper at the kitchen table because James's house was not large enough for a formal dining room, and the informality of it somehow made everything easier. Mrs. Garza, who was a stout Mexican woman of 50 who had cooked for James since he'd set up his practice, and who had strong opinions about most things including the desirability of Charlotte getting married, served them slow-cooked beef with dried chilies and fresh tortillas, and the food was good enough to dissolve whatever formal awkwardness might have existed. Wallace told them about where he was from, which was a small ranch in the hill country south of Austin, where he had grown up as the middle of 5 boys and had learned to ride before he could properly read. He had come north looking for better wages and had landed at the Calloway Ranch with the intention of saving enough to buy his own small piece of land. "Do you have land in mind?" Charlotte asked. "There is a piece out past the creek bend," he said, "about 4 miles east of town. It is not large, about 90 acres, but the grass is good and there is a spring that runs year-round." He paused. "I ride past it sometimes. It has a view of the escarpment that is worth looking at." Charlotte thought about a spring that ran year-round and a view of the Llano Estacado escarpment at sunset, and something quiet and warm moved through her that she did not try to name. After supper, James made a business of saying he had papers to review, which was his way of allowing them to sit in the parlor and talk without obvious supervision, and they talked until it was late enough that propriety required him to leave. He stood at the door again with his hat in his hands and looked at her with that direct, patient look that she was beginning to recognize as his natural mode of attention. "I would like to call again," he said, "if that is agreeable." "It is agreeable," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Then I will come again." He came the following Saturday, and the one after that, and the one after that. By the 4th visit, James had stopped pretending to review papers in the other room, and had simply said good night after supper and gone to bed, which was both a declaration of trust and a thing Charlotte appreciated more than she said. By the 5th visit, Wallace had taken to arriving a little earlier and staying a little later, and their conversations had expanded from the careful territory of first acquaintance into something richer and more honest. He told her about the years before the Calloway Ranch, including a winter he had spent further west in country that was harder and lonelier than anything she had ever seen, and a period of his life that he spoke about carefully, in the way people speak about things that were difficult but shaped them in ways they do not regret. He had worked for a man who was not a good man, and he had left when the work required him to be something he was not willing to be. Charlotte told him about San Antonio and her father, who had been a schoolteacher and had died when she was 16, and her mother, who had been a precise and competent woman who had held their household together through sheer force of will, and eventually married again, happily, a farmer outside of Austin. She told him about why she had followed James to Millhaven, which was partly because James had asked her and partly because she had been restless in a way she could not explain, and a new town had seemed like the right answer. "Did it work?" he asked, "coming here?" She looked at him across the parlor in the lamplight and thought about 3 years of ledgers and inventory and Sunday dinners with James and Mrs. Garza and evenings that were comfortable but that had lacked something she had not had a name for. "It is working," she said, with a small, precise emphasis on the present tense. He looked at her steadily, and she felt that sensation again, that July afternoon warmth, and this time she did not look away from it. The water trough on Main Street became, in those weeks, a small landmark of local legend. Someone had tried to scrub the paint off in the first few days, and it had faded slightly but not vanished. And then the prevailing opinion of the town had shifted from mild scandal to something closer to civic pride, and by the end of the first week, nobody was scrubbing anything. Mrs. Prout referred to it as our little romantic monument. In the pages of the Millhaven Gazette's weekly column about community items, which made Charlotte groan but which also made her press her lips together against a smile when she thought no one was looking. The Calloway Ranch was where Wallace spent his days, and his days were the long, physical, uncomplicated work of cattle country in 1878. The Calloways ran several hundred head on grass that stretched toward the horizon in every direction, and the spring was always the busiest season, the time of branding and mending fences and driving cattle to new grazing. He worked hard and slept soundly and saved steadily, and when he rode the east pasture fence line he could see, about 4 miles out, the rise of land past the creek bend that he had been thinking about for the better part of a year. He had spoken to the land office in early February, before he had ever said anything to Charlotte at all, which was something he had not told her because he was not a man who made declarations until he had the actual ground under his feet to support them. The land was available, and the price was within the range of what he would have by summer if he continued as he was going. He had his savings in a bank in town and his plans in his head, and a quiet certainty about the direction of things that had been with him since before he had ever painted anything on any water trough. That certainty had been the real reason for the painting, in the end. It was not impulsiveness. It was the opposite of impulsiveness. He had thought about Charlotte Hart for 6 months in the careful, thorough way he thought about things he considered important, and when he had finished thinking he had picked up the paint brush because he needed her to know before he could take another step in the direction he intended to go. He was not the sort of man who could move toward a future while keeping its most important element uninformed. In April, something happened that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with it. There was a man named Deacon Price who had a habit of coming into Hargrove's on Friday afternoons when he had been drinking. He was not from Millhaven proper, but worked at a cattle operation some distance out, and he had a reputation for being difficult when he had taken too much whiskey, though he had never been anything worse than loudly unpleasant in Charlotte's store. On the 3rd Friday in April, he came in later than usual and drunker than usual, and what started as a loud argument about the price of ammunition progressed into him putting his hand around Charlotte's wrist across the counter in a way that was both painful and frightening. Charlotte, who was not a woman who frightened easily, went very still and looked at him with those gray-green eyes at their most precise and said, "You need to let go of my arm." He did not. Mr. Hargrove was in the back and had not heard the escalation, and Tommy Wills was sweeping the sidewalk outside, and Charlotte was doing the arithmetic of the situation when the bell above the door opened. Wallace had not been expected. He had come into town on an errand for the ranch, and he had stopped at the store because he stopped at the store whenever he was in town now, with the ease of established habit. He came through the door and took in the scene in approximately 1 second, and what happened after that was quiet and efficient and over quickly. He crossed the store floor, positioned himself beside Charlotte, looked at Deacon Price with an expression that contained no anger and no drama and nothing except a kind of absolute calm, and said, "Let go." Deacon Price looked at him, looked at his size, looked at his eyes. Let go. He left the store with considerably more haste than he had entered it, and Tommy Wills, watching from the sidewalk, later told everyone that he had never seen a man move so fast while still technically walking. Charlotte looked at her wrist, which was reddened but not badly hurt. Then she looked at Wallace. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was not entirely steady. He looked at her wrist with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he looked at her face. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I am fine." He nodded, and she could see him deciding to believe her because she had said it and he respected what she said. He did not make a fuss. He did not insist on hovering or making it into something larger than it was. He simply accepted her word and stayed in the store for a while longer than he needed to, talking to Mr. Hargrove about something inconsequential until the color had returned to Charlotte's face and the slight tremor in her hands had settled. When he left, he stopped at the door and turned and said, with a quietness that was entirely for her, "I will be in town again on Thursday." "I will be here Thursday," she said. He nodded and left. She thought about that for the rest of the day, the specific combination of his presence and his restraint, the way he had handled Deacon Price without violence and without theater, and the way he had stayed without crowding her, and the way he had found the most ordinary possible words to tell her that he was not going anywhere. She thought about the spring past the creek bend and the view of the escarpment. On Thursday he came, and they talked in the store with the ease of people who have moved past the formality of establishing themselves and into the easier territory of simply knowing each other. He helped her move a crate of canned goods that was too heavy, and she helped him sort out an arithmetic discrepancy in the ranch's account, and at some point they were standing close enough together over the ledger that she could feel the warmth of his arm alongside hers, and neither of them moved away. "The land past the creek bend," she said, without looking up from the ledger. "Have you made a decision about it?" "Yes," he said. She looked up then, and they were very close, closer than they had been before, and she could see the dark steadiness in his eyes and the small scar along his jaw from some old piece of ranch work, and she thought that there was not a single thing about this man that felt uncertain or temporary. "Tell me about it," she said. And he did. He told her about the spring and the 90 acres and the grass and the view, and while he talked she listened and understood that he was not describing a piece of land. He was describing a life. He was asking her, without yet using the words, if it was the kind of life she could imagine. She was thinking about how to respond to something that had not yet been directly said when Mr. Hargrove came through from the back room and asked if anyone wanted coffee. And the moment rearranged itself into something more ordinary, though the substance of it remained. By May, the whole town of Millhaven had collectively decided that Wallace Mercer and Charlotte Hart were going to be married, and had begun behaving accordingly. Women who did business at the store would find opportunities to tell Charlotte what a fine man Wallace was. In the slightly too bright tones of people sharing information, they were fairly certain the recipient already possessed. Men at the saloon clapped Wallace on the shoulder and made remarks that he deflected with a calm and consistent good humor. Mrs. Prout wrote another item in the Gazette about the continued romantic atmosphere of Millhaven's famous water trough, which was by now completely faded, but had been photographed by a traveling photographer, and the image tacked to the wall inside the saloon, which Charlotte felt was at least one step too far, but was apparently not within her power to prevent. Through all of this, Wallace and Charlotte continued their Saturday evenings and their store conversations and their Thursday encounters, and the thing between them grew and deepened, and became something that both of them recognized as significant without having yet put formal words around it. That changed on an evening in late May when Wallace came to call, and James had the good sense to announce early that he was going to bed with a headache, which Charlotte strongly suspected was not an actual headache, and they sat on the front porch of James's house in the warm evening air while the stars came up over the flat Texas dark. Wallace was quiet for a long time in the way that meant he was thinking something through to its final edge, and Charlotte waited with the patience she had learned he deserved. "I'm going to buy the land," he said. "I have enough. I spoke to the land office last week." I know, she said. You have been saving toward it since before I met you. He turned his head to look at her. In the dark, his eyes were very steady. I'm going to build a house on it, a proper house, not a lined shack. That will take time, she said. Yes, he said, but it is worth doing right. He paused. I would like to know, while I am building it, what kind of house to build. She understood him perfectly. Question was not architectural. The night insects were singing in the darkness, and the sky above the flat plain was enormous and full of stars. And Charlotte Hart, who was practical and sensible and not given to melodrama, felt something settle in her that had been suspended for a very long time, like a held breath finally released. A house with a good kitchen, she said, and enough windows to see the light in the morning. He was quiet for a moment, then. And bedrooms. At least 2, she said. To start. He turned fully toward her on the porch step, and she turned to him, and he reached out and took her hand in his, which was the first time he had touched her in anything other than accident. And his hand was warm and solid and completely certain, and she thought that she had never in her life felt more sure of a direction. Charlotte, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the way he said it, careful and deliberate, like something he had been waiting to say for a long time, made her close her eyes for just a moment. Yes, she said, though he had not yet asked the question. He heard the answer in it, and the corner of his mouth moved, and then it became an actual full smile, which she had seen very rarely and which transformed his face entirely. I have not asked yet, he said. I know, she said. Ask properly. He looked at her with that smile still working at his mouth, and reached into the pocket of his jacket and brought out a ring, which startled her because she had not expected it yet. A simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, dark red as the paint he had used on the water trough. I have been carrying that for 3 weeks, he said. I bought it from the jeweler in Amarillo when I went with the Callaway cattle drive in April. She looked at the ring and then at him and felt a warmth in her chest that was so complete she did not have words for it. Charlotte Hart, he said, will you marry me? Yes, she said, with the same certainty she had had for several minutes now. I will marry you, Wallace Mercer. He put the ring on her finger, and they sat on the porch together in the Texas dark with her hand in his, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else for a while, which was, Charlotte thought, one of the most comfortable feelings she had ever experienced. James came to the doorway approximately 4 minutes later, looked at them both, looked at the ring, and said, with the satisfied air of a man whose headache had resolved itself, well, about time. The wedding was set for July, which gave Wallace enough time to break ground on the house and gave Charlotte enough time to organize everything in the brisk, comprehensive way she organized most things. James Hart was delighted. Mrs. Garza began planning food for the reception with an enthusiasm that suggested she had been waiting for this opportunity for some time. Edwin Hargrove said he would contribute a case of his best canned goods as a wedding gift, and seemed genuinely moved by the entire occasion. In June, Wallace bought the land. He stood at the land office with the Callaway Ranch's foreman, an older man named Bud Harkins, who had agreed to stand as a witness, and signed his name on the deed with a hand that was steady because he had been sure of this for a very long time. 93 acres along the creek bend, with a spring that ran year-round and a view of the Llano Estacado escarpment that was, as he had told Charlotte, worth looking at. He came to the store that afternoon and laid the deed on the counter in front of her. She picked it up and read it carefully the way she read everything, and then she set it down and looked at him and said, "It is real." "It is real," he said. She smiled at him, and it was not the polite professional smile she kept for customers or even the warm smile she gave to James and Mrs. Garza, but something altogether more private that he had only seen a handful of times, and which he intended to spend a considerable portion of his life earning. "Show me," she said. "Take me to see it." That Saturday, instead of the usual supper, Wallace came in the wagon with James's grudging blessing, and they drove the 4 miles east of town along the road that curved past the creek bend. Charlotte sat beside him on the wagon seat with the warm June wind in her face and the smell of grass and cedar in the air. And when he stopped the wagon at the edge of the property, she stepped down and walked to the top of the gentle rise where the spring came up clear and cold from the limestone and ran down toward the creek through the grass. She turned to look at the escarpment. It was late afternoon, and the light was doing something extraordinary to the face of the Llano Estacado, the long flat-topped mesa that defined this part of the world, turning it from pale limestone to deep amber, to a kind of burnished rose that had no exact name. The sky above it was enormous and layered with cloud that the setting sun was painting in colors that seemed almost too dramatic to be real. Charlotte stood very still and looked at it for a long time. Wallace stood beside her and watched her face, which was the thing he found more worth watching than any landscape. "I see why you ride out here," she said finally. "I rode out here more than was strictly necessary," he admitted. She looked at him sidelong. "To look at the view. To think about what it would look like with a house on it," he said, "and someone in it." She turned to face the landscape again and said, "Here," pointing to a spot near the spring where the ground was level and the view was unobstructed. "The house goes here." He looked at the spot and nodded. "That is where I was going to put it." "Good," she said. "Then we agree." He began building in the last week of June with the help of Bud Harkins and 2 other hands from the Calloway Ranch, and James Hart came out on 2 Saturdays and proved more useful with a hammer than Charlotte had expected. The house was not large, but it was square and solid, with thick walls and a real wood floor and a good kitchen with a proper iron stove. Wallace framed in 3 windows on the east side so the morning light would come in strong, because Charlotte had said she wanted to see the light in the morning, and he had noted that down in the same place. He noted things that mattered. The wedding was on the 12th of July, in the little church on the east end of Main Street, which was full to overflowing because Millhaven had collectively decided that this was a community event of the highest order. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony with a warmth that suggested he had been hoping to do it for some time. Charlotte wore a dress of white cotton lawn with small embroidered flowers along the collar that she and Mrs. Garza had made together over the previous month, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that included bluebonnets because it seemed right, and she walked down the aisle on James's arm with the calm, certain step of a woman who knows exactly where she is going. Wallace stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him, and felt the same crack-open sensation in his chest that he had felt kneeling beside the water trough in the pre-dawn gray of that April morning, only larger, much larger. The kind of feeling that a man who is not prone to sentiment recognizes as the most important thing he has ever felt, and holds accordingly. Reverend Marsh said the words and they said their words back, and when Wallace put the gold ring on Charlotte's finger, it was a different ring from the garnet engagement ring, a plain gold wedding band, and Charlotte put the matching ring on his hand with a steadiness that was entirely her own, and they looked at each other across the small formal distance that the ceremony required, and both of them knew that the distance was about to become permanent history. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Marsh said. Wallace put his hands on either side of Charlotte's face, and she looked up at him with those gray-green eyes, and he kissed her properly, which was not at all the brief decorous kiss that most wedding ceremonies in Millhaven featured, and the congregation responded with a level of enthusiasm that made Reverend Marsh clear his throat into his Bible. The reception was outside, on the grass in front of the church, with Mrs. Garza's food spread across long tables and a fiddle player from the saloon who turned out to be genuinely talented, and the whole town of Millhaven ate and drank and danced and talked until the sun was long gone and the stars were out in full force. James danced with Charlotte and said, with his face turned away so that she would not see him being emotional, "Papa would have liked him." "I know," Charlotte said. "I thought about that." James cleared his throat and changed the subject to something practical, which was his way with feelings, and Charlotte let him. Wallace danced with Charlotte twice, which was all propriety strictly allowed at a public gathering, but he held her hand between the dances and stood close enough that the warmth of him was constant and present. And when the evening wound down and it was time to leave, he brought the wagon around and Charlotte embraced James and Mrs. Garza and said her goodbyes, and they drove east out of town under the stars toward the land past the creek bend. The house was not quite finished. There were still details to complete, trim work and shutters, and the garden patch Charlotte had already planned. But the main rooms were done, and the stove was installed, and the bed was real and solid, and made from walnut wood that Wallace had spent 3 Sundays building, because Charlotte had admired walnut furniture in Hargrove's catalog, and he had quietly committed that to memory. She stood in the kitchen of their house for the first time as Mrs. Wallace Mercer and looked at the iron stove and the wooden countertop and the 3 eastern windows that were dark now with night but would be bright with morning light in a few hours, and felt something so complete and right that she could not immediately find the language for it. Wallace stood in the doorway behind her, having seen to the horse and wagon. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She turned to look at him in their kitchen in their house on their land, and she said, "I like it very much." He crossed the kitchen floor and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against his chest, and they stood like that for a moment, looking at the dark windows that would soon let in the morning. "I am glad," he said into her hair. And that was that, and that was everything. The first summer of their marriage was the kind of summer that becomes, in later years, the standard against which other summers are measured. Charlotte continued working at Hargrove's store, at least until the house and land required enough of her attention that she and Mr. Hargrove agreed on a reduced arrangement, 3 days a week instead of 6, which suited everyone. Wallace worked to establish the new operation on their land, which was not yet a full ranch but was heading in that direction. A small herd of cattle, a kitchen garden that Charlotte managed with the same precision she had applied to the store's inventory, and 2 horses of their own in addition to Wallace's working horses. The mornings were exactly as Charlotte had hoped. She would wake in the walnut bed in the east-facing room, and the light would come in through the windows onto the floor in long pale stripes that slowly turned gold as the sun climbed, and Wallace would already be outside or would be dressing in the quiet, unhurried way he moved through the mornings, and she would lie still for exactly long enough to feel grateful before getting up. He was a good man at close range, which was what mattered. Some men are impressive from a distance and complicated up close, but Wallace was straightforwardly himself in all weathers and conditions. He was not an easy man in the sense of being simple, because he was not simple, but he was consistent, and consistency, Charlotte had come to understand, was one of the most precious qualities a person could have. He was careful with her in the ways that counted. He remembered what she had said. He watched for what she needed without asking in a way that would diminish the asking. He disagreed with her when he disagreed, which was not often but was, when it happened, frank and honest, and they found that they could disagree and come back from it without anything being damaged, which seemed to Charlotte as important as any of the finer feelings. In October of that first year, Charlotte realized she was expecting a child. She told Wallace on a quiet evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them, and she watched his face do the thing she had seen it do very rarely, the thing where everything that was normally controlled and internal came briefly to the surface. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it and did not say anything for a moment, just looked at her hand in his, and then he looked up at her. "Are you well?" he asked, because that was what he asked first. "I am very well," she said. He nodded slowly. The corner of his mouth moved. Then his whole face moved, and he smiled, and it was the kind of smile she had never seen from anyone else, the kind that suggests a man is feeling something he does not have adequate tools to express. "Good," he said, which was entirely inadequate and entirely sufficient. She laughed at him for it, not unkindly, and he accepted her laughing at him with the equanimity that she had come to expect from him in most things. And she thought that this, too, this easy laughter between them, was one of the things she wanted to hold on to and not take for granted. She told James the following Sunday when they went to his house for dinner, and James sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then at Charlotte and then at Wallace, and then he said, "Well, Uncle James," in a tone of such pure surprise that she and Wallace both laughed, and James began laughing too, and Mrs. Garza came in from the kitchen to find out what all the noise was, and when she was told, she immediately announced she was making a celebratory dessert, and swept back into the kitchen with the air of a woman whose plan for the universe was proceeding on schedule. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was not a mild one. The Texas Panhandle had a streak of hard weather in January that kept people close to their hearths and made the roads between town and the outlying properties difficult. Charlotte continued working her 3 days at Hargrove's when the weather allowed, and Wallace managed the cattle and the property through the worst of it with the steady, practical competence that was his particular genius. There was a night in late January when a norther came through that dropped the temperature to something extraordinary, and Wallace was out with the cattle, and Charlotte sat by the stove with a book she was not reading and waited for him to come back. And when he came through the door finally, cold through and through, and with ice in his beard, the relief that went through her was so fierce and sudden that she went directly to him and put her arms around him and held on, which was not her usual greeting. He put his cold arms around her and said, "I am all right," into the top of her head. "I know," she said, "I know you are." She made him coffee and he sat by the stove and thawed out slowly, and she sat across from him and they talked about practical things, the cattle and the pipes and the state of the road, and the alarm in her chest gradually settled back to its normal quiet, and she understood that this was part of it too, this specific vulnerability that came with having someone to lose. She had not expected love to feel this much like something real and physical, like weather that could reach her. She had been a sensible woman before, and she was a sensible woman still, but she was beginning to understand that being sensible and being in love were not in opposition. They were simply different ways of attending to the same life. Their son was born in late May of 1879, on a Tuesday morning when the light was doing everything it could do with those east-facing windows. He was a solid, healthy boy with Wallace's dark hair and Charlotte's gray-green eyes, and they named him Thomas James Mercer. Thomas for no particular reason, except that it was the right name and James for Charlotte's brother, which made James' heart go extremely quiet for a moment when he was told, and then leave the room briefly before coming back with red eyes and the expression of a man who has been very moved and intends to pretend otherwise. Wallace held his son for the first time with the same careful deliberateness he applied to things he recognized as important, and Charlotte watched his face with a particular quality of attention. He looked at the baby, and the baby looked at something beyond him with the unfocused gaze of the newly arrived, and Wallace's expression was one she had never seen before on him, something quiet and enormous and absolutely certain. "Thomas," he said softly, by way of introduction. Charlotte felt tears run down her face, which surprised her because she was generally not a crying woman. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like himself," Wallace said, which was probably correct. James arrived an hour later with flowers from Mrs. Garza's garden and stood over the baby with the expression of a man who has not spent much time with infants and is not sure what protocol requires. And then the baby's hand closed around James's finger with the sudden, powerful certainty that babies have, and James's face went entirely undone. "Well," he managed. "Hello, Thomas." The baby, apparently satisfied with this greeting, held on. The years that followed were full. They were full in the way that good years are, not without difficulty, because difficulty was native to the land and the time and the work, but with a richness that came from the combination of honest labor and genuine love, and the specific deep pleasure of building something that is worth building. Wallace expanded the cattle operation slowly and carefully, the way he did most things, never overextending but always moving forward. By 1881, they had a proper working ranch of several hundred acres, having purchased the neighboring parcel when it became available, and Wallace employed 2 hands of his own. Charlotte kept the accounts for the ranch with the precision she had always brought to numbers, and continued a limited involvement with Hargrove's store, managing the accounts on a consulting basis that suited everyone. Thomas grew into a child who had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, a combination that made him both easy to manage and occasionally unsettling, since he missed very little and had a habit of observing adults with an attention that made adults feel they had been accurately catalogued. In the spring of 1882, Charlotte told Wallace she was expecting again. He received this news the same way he had received the first, with a brief visible crack in his composure, followed by immediate practical concern for her well-being, and then the quiet, deep pleasure of a man who considers his family the most important thing he has made. Their second child was another son, born in November of 1882, whom they named Daniel after Wallace's father. Daniel was entirely different from Thomas from the first weeks, louder and more immediately expressive of his opinions, with Charlotte's dark hair and a smile that had appeared at 6 weeks and had not left since. Thomas, who was 3 years old and had been informed of the situation in advance, received his brother with a gravity appropriate to an older child and a somewhat proprietary attitude that Charlotte recognized as the beginning of lifelong management of a younger sibling. The ranch prospered. The grass was good, and the cattle were healthy, and Wallace had a genuine eye for the work, the kind of knowledge that came from growing up in cattle country and had been refined by years of paying close attention to what the land required. He was known around Millhaven as a careful and honest dealer, which in that country was the same as being known as a successful one. Charlotte was known as the woman who kept the books for the Mercer Ranch and 3 other operations in the county, because her reputation for precision had spread, and she had found that this work suited her well, the kind of work that could be done from her own kitchen table when the boys were asleep. In 1883, Millhaven got its first proper telegraph office, which connected it to Amarillo and points beyond, and the town grew a little larger and a little more connected to the larger world. The railroad spur that had originally brought the town into existence was expanded, which brought new commerce and new people. Among the new people who arrived in the spring of 1883 was a woman named Vera Purcell, who came from somewhere east and set up a small school at the edge of town, because Millhaven's existing arrangement for children's education was a once-a-week affair with the Reverend's wife that was better than nothing but not much better. Vera Purcell was young and determined and slightly overwhelmed by the reality of a Texas frontier town after whatever she had left behind, and Charlotte took her under her protective arm with a friendliness that was entirely genuine. "You will adjust," Charlotte told her over tea at the kitchen table one afternoon while Thomas, who was 4 now, sat on the floor with Daniel and performed the complicated work of stacking wooden blocks. "It takes a season. Does everyone here know everyone else's business?" Vera asked in a tone that suggested she had already discovered the answer to this question. Charlotte smiled. "Yes, you learn to live with it, or you come to appreciate it." "How do you come to appreciate it?" "When something happens and you need people," Charlotte said. "They are already there, they already know." Vera considered this. She was looking at the kitchen, at the morning light that came through the east windows, at the evidence of a life that was plainly well made. "You are happy here," she said, in the tone of someone for whom this is not yet an obvious possibility for themselves. "Very," Charlotte said, simply and without self-consciousness. That evening she told Wallace about Vera Purcell, and he listened with the attention he gave to everything she said, and remarked that a proper school would be good for Thomas in another year or 2. Then he looked at Charlotte across the supper table with the comfortable directness of 5 years of marriage and said, "Are you happy here?" She looked at him with those gray-green eyes that had been reading him accurately since the first day he had walked into Hargrove's store, and she said, "Do you need to ask?" he smiled. "No," he said. "I do not need to ask." He had not needed to ask for a long time. He could see it in her, the contentment that had settled into her bones and become part of how she moved through her days, the ease she had in the house and on the land and with the boys and with him. It was not the happiness of someone who had settled for a tolerable life, but the happiness of someone who had exactly the life they wanted, which was rarer and more valuable. But he liked hearing her say it, and she knew he liked hearing it, and so she said it in different ways and at different times, because that was how they were with each other. The summer of 1883 was the summer that Thomas Mercer, at 4.5 years old, developed a passionate interest in the water trough on Main Street. It began when Charlotte brought the boys into town for a supply run, and Thomas, who noticed things, saw the very faint remains of red paint on the old trough, almost entirely faded now, but still faintly visible in the grain of the wood in certain lights. "Mama," Thomas said, crouching beside the trough with the focused attention he gave to things that required explanation. "What is this?" Charlotte looked at the faded paint and felt warmth move through her. "Letters," she said. "Someone painted letters there a long time ago." "What do they say?" She looked at him. He looked back at her with Wallace's steadiness in Wallace's eyes on his small face. "They say my name," she said. Thomas frowned. "Why is your name on the water trough?" "Because your father put it there," she said. "Before we were married, before you were born." Thomas considered this information with the seriousness of a child processing a new concept. "Why did he put your name on the water trough?" he said. Charlotte crouched down beside him and looked at the faded red letters in the old wood and said, "Because he wanted everyone to know he loved me, before he had even told me himself." Thomas looked at the trough, then at his mother. "Did you know when he painted it?" "No," she said. "Everyone else in town knew before I did. I found out when I came to work that morning, and there it was." Thomas thought about this. "What did you do?" "I went back into the store," she said, "and I thought about it for a very long time. And then your father came to find me," she said, "as I knew he would." Thomas stood up, satisfied, and went to look at something else. But Charlotte stayed crouched beside the trough for a moment longer, her hand resting on the old wood where the ghost of red paint still marked his name for her, and she felt the whole story of it move through her from that April dawn in 1878 to this summer morning in 1883. 5 years and a marriage and 2 sons and 93 acres of good land with a spring that ran year-round. She stood up, took Daniel's hand because he was toddling toward the middle of the street with characteristic lack of caution, and went to do her errands. That evening she told Wallace what Thomas had asked, and he listened to the whole of it with his elbows on the kitchen table and his hands folded under his chin, and at the end he said, "What did you tell him?" She told him what she had said about wanting everyone to know and about coming to find her as she knew he would. He looked at her with that direct, steady gaze of his. "Did you know I would come?" "Yes," she said. "By then I knew." "By then," he repeated, gently testing the qualifier. "I suspected from the beginning," she admitted, which was not a thing she had said before, and it was exact and true. The corner of his mouth moved. "Did you?" "A woman knows," she said, with a dignity that she was aware was slightly undermined by the warmth in her face, which she could not help, and which she did not try to hide from him anymore. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers in the kitchen lamplight, and she turned her hand over and held his. In the winter of 1884, Bud Harkins, who had been the Callaway foreman for 20 years, and who had stood as a witness when Wallace bought his land and swung hammers when they built the house, retired from cattle work on account of a knee that had been giving him trouble since a horse had fallen on it the previous spring. He came out to the Mercer ranch on his last day before he left for his daughter's house in San Antonio, and he sat at Charlotte's kitchen table and drank her coffee, and looked at the 2 boys and the well-ordered house and the obvious prosperity of the operation. "You have done good work here, boy," he said to Wallace, in the way of older men who have watched younger men become themselves. "We have done good work," Wallace said, and his eyes went to Charlotte, and she saw the acknowledgment in them that she had always seen. his consistent understanding that what they had been built together. Bud looked at them both and nodded. "That is the right answer," he said. After Bud left, Charlotte stood at the kitchen window for a moment and watched him ride down the road toward town, and thought about time. About how much had happened in the years since she had come to Millhaven as a woman of 21 from a farm outside San Antonio, following her brother into the unknown with the restlessness of someone who did not yet know what she was looking for. About how the thing you are looking for sometimes finds you, kneeling in the mud beside a water trough at 5 in the morning with a too-wide paintbrush and a pot of red paint. Wallace came to stand beside her at the window. He looked at the road where Bud had gone, and then he looked at his wife. "What are you thinking?" he asked, which was not something he asked often because he was generally good at reading what she was thinking. The fact that he was asking meant he could not read it this time. "I am thinking," she said, "about that first morning, when I came outside and saw the trough. I am thinking about what Tommy Wills said." "Wallace Mercer," he said, quoting from memory with a slight increase in the warmth of his voice, "everybody knows." She laughed, and the laugh was the same one she had given him across the counter in Hargrove's on one of his first visits, unguarded and genuine, the one that had done something to his face that he had never forgotten. "I am thinking," she said, "that I am glad everyone knew. I am glad it was that public and that foolish and that large." He looked at her. "Are you?" "Because if it had been quiet," she said, "I might have talked myself out of it. I was very good at talking myself out of things." She looked up at him. "You made it impossible to ignore. That was the point, I think. That was why you did it." He considered this for a moment. "I did it," he said carefully, "because I needed you to know. Because I could not take another step in any direction without you knowing." She had understood that for a long time, but hearing him say it in the kitchen of their house on a winter afternoon with the sound of Thomas and Daniel in the other room, and the smell of coffee and wood smoke in the air made it hit her again with a freshness that felt like the first time. She put her hand on his chest and felt the steady beat of his heart under her palm. "I know," she said. He covered her hand with his. That spring, Charlotte and Wallace had a conversation about the future that was practical and honest in the way of all their conversations about things that mattered. The ranch was doing well enough that Wallace could hire a third hand and start thinking about a larger operation. Charlotte's bookkeeping work for other ranches had grown to the point where she was regularly corresponding with operations in Amarillo and had more requests than she could take on. Thomas would be starting school with Vera Purcell in the fall. Daniel was talking in long, complicated sentences that frequently surprised adults who had expected simpler things from a 2-year-old. "What do you want?" Wallace asked her in the evening, the way he periodically asked, because he thought it was important to ask and not to assume. "I want what I have," she said, which was not a deflection but the most precise answer she could give. "And I want to keep building it with you." "More cattle," he said. "More everything," she said. "But carefully, the way we do things." He nodded. They were in agreement as they generally were, and where they were not in agreement they worked through it with the honest consideration they had developed over 6 years of genuine partnership. In the fall of 1885, Thomas started school with Vera Purcell. And Vera Purcell told Charlotte with some wonderment that Thomas Mercer at 6 years old was the most organized student she had ever taught, which Charlotte received with the quiet pride of a woman who recognized her own traits in her child. Thomas told them in the evenings about everything he had learned with a thoroughness that suggested teaching might be in his future, or possibly law, which made James Hart extremely pleased when he visited for Sunday dinners. James was still practicing law in Millhaven and had, in 1884, married a woman named Alice Fowler, who had come to town from Virginia, with a directness of manner that had apparently charmed James immediately, and had certainly charmed Charlotte, who recognized in Alice a similar quality of paying close attention to the world. The two families, the Harts and the Mercers, spent Sundays together and holidays together, and had accumulated the shared history of people who consider themselves genuinely family, which they were in every way that counted. James and Wallace had developed the easy companionship of men who are very different from each other, and have decided they like each other anyway, which was the best kind of friendship. Alice had a baby of her own in the fall of 1885, a daughter named Clara, and Daniel Mercer, who was 3, declared himself Clara's best friend with a decisiveness that amused all 4 parents, and apparently did not strike Daniel as anything less than entirely reasonable. In December of 1885, on an evening when the boys were in bed and James and Alice had gone home after Sunday supper, Charlotte sat at the kitchen table with the ledger books for the ranch, and Wallace sat across from her with the plans for a new barn he intended to start in spring, and the lamplight was warm and steady, and the stove was going, and everything was quiet. Charlotte put down her pen and looked at her husband across the table, at the familiar lines of his face, and the way the lamplight caught the silver that had started at his temples, which she found she liked considerably more than she had expected to like the evidence of passing years on a face she loved. "Wallace," she said. He looked up from his plans, immediately present in the way he always was when she spoke his name. "I am going to have another baby," she said. He set down his pencil, and she watched his face do the thing she had now seen 3 times and would never stop finding beautiful, the brief visible emergence of everything internal, the crack of feeling through the careful surface. "Are you well?" he asked, because it was always what he asked first and always what she loved most about the asking. "I am very well," she said. He reached across the ledger books and the ranch plans and the accumulated paperwork of their life and took her hand. "3, he said. 3, she confirmed. "James," he said, and she could hear him calculating, "is going to be extremely pleased." She laughed. "James is going to claim some credit for being a good uncle." "He is a good uncle," Wallace said. "He is," she agreed. Wallace held her hand across the table and looked at her with the steadiness that had been his constant mode of looking at her for 7 years now, and she looked back at him with the precision and warmth that was hers. And between them was everything they had made together, the ranch and the house and the boys asleep in their beds, and the spring that ran year-round past the east window, and the view of the escarpment at sunset that was still, on any given evening, worth looking at. The baby was born in the summer of 1886, a girl this time, with Charlotte's dark hair and Wallace's dark eyes, and a temperament that announced itself from the first hours as firmly her own. They named her Emma Frances Mercer, Frances for Wallace's mother who had died the winter before, a loss he had carried quietly in the way he carried difficult things, and Emma because Charlotte had held the name in mind for years without telling anyone. Thomas, who was 7, received his sister with the measured assessment of an older child, and announced that she was very small but probably acceptable. Daniel, who was 4, was immediately and completely devoted, and Emma from her earliest weeks seemed to have a specific attachment to Daniel's voice, which she tracked with an attention that made him very proud. The house was fuller and louder and more alive than it had ever been, and Charlotte managed it with the comprehensive precision she had always applied to things she cared about, and Wallace worked the land with the steady, long-view purpose of a man who is building something intended to outlast him. They were in love in the way that people are when they have been in love for a long time, and have let it become the foundation of their life rather than its decoration. It was not the acute, distracting sensation of the beginning, though that remained too in different forms and at different moments. It was something more architectural. The way a well-built house is more than the sum of its timber and stone. It was in the Thursday mornings when she brought him coffee in the yard, and he stopped whatever he was doing to drink it standing beside her, both of them looking at the land in the early light. It was in the evenings when the children were in bed, and they sat at the kitchen table with their respective work, and the comfortable silence between them was full of presence rather than absence. It was in the way he still, after 7 years, chose his words with care when he spoke to her, and the way she still found herself reading his face with an attention that was not habitual but always fresh. It was in the night of a January storm when he came in frozen, and she went directly to him and he said, "I am all right," and she believed him and was glad. In the spring of 1887, Vera Purcell married a rancher named Martin Cross, who had been courting her for 2 years with a persistence that had gradually overcome her early resistance. And Charlotte stood at the wedding with Wallace Hart, and felt the particular pleasure of watching a friend find her way to the same kind of happiness that Charlotte knew herself. Vera and Martin stayed in Millhaven, and Vera kept teaching, and the school grew into a proper 3-room building that the town financed through a combination of donations and a small levy, which James Hart managed with his usual legal precision. The water trough on Main Street had been replaced in 1884, the old one finally giving out entirely, and the new one was plain bare wood with no history written on it. But the story had outlasted the trough. People in Millhaven still told it, the story of the cowboy who had painted the woman's name in red letters large enough for the whole town to read, and had gone back to work while the town woke up and found out, and had come to the store that afternoon with his hat in his hands to ask if she had seen it. It was the kind of story that a town holds on to because it says something about what the town believes in. Charlotte had heard it told in the third person more than once, the story of a cowboy and a woman, with herself removed enough from its telling to find it affecting in the way you can only find your own story affecting when you are far enough into the life it began to see its shape. She told it to Emma when Emma was old enough to listen, when Emma was 5 years old and sitting on her mother's knee at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with the east light coming through the windows, asking one of the endless questions that were Emma's primary mode of being in the world. "How did Papa tell you he loved you?" Emma asked, with the directness of children who have not yet learned to approach certain questions sideways. Charlotte looked at her daughter's dark eyes, which were Wallace's eyes exactly, and said, "He painted my name on the water trough in town, in big red letters, so big that everyone in town saw it before I did." Emma considered this. "Why did he not just tell you?" "He was working up to telling me," Charlotte said. "He wanted me to know it was serious. He wanted it to be the kind of thing that could not be taken back." Emma looked at her with those steady dark eyes. "Was it serious?" "Very," Charlotte said. "Did it scare you?" Charlotte thought about that April morning in 1878, standing in front of Hargrove's store reading her name in red paint, with the color rising in her face and Mrs. Prout watching from the post office. "A little," she said honestly. "It is serious to be known that way. It means someone has looked at you very carefully and made a decision about what they see." Emma was quiet for a moment. "And what did Papa see?" Charlotte smiled. "You would have to ask him," she said. "But I think you probably already know the answer." Emma turned on her knee and looked toward the window where, outside in the yard, Wallace could be seen crossing from the barn to the fence line with the long, steady stride that was entirely his own, hat slightly pushed back on his head, Thomas walking alongside him and matching his pace with 7-year-old concentration. He stopped, said something to Thomas, put his hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder, and they both looked at the fence where something apparently required attention. Emma looked at this scene and then at her mother and said, with the certainty of a 6-year-old who has been paying close attention to her father her entire life, "He sees that you are the best." Charlotte's throat did something inconvenient. "Yes," she said, once she had managed it. "I believe he does." That evening after supper, when the children were settled and the kitchen was quiet, she told Wallace what Emma had said. She told it to him simply, sitting across the table from him in the lamplight, because she had learned that this was one of the things love was, the sharing of the small specific things that would otherwise be lost. He listened to all of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She has your eyes for things." "She has your eyes," Charlotte said. "Your way of looking," he said, "of seeing." She looked at him across the table with that way of looking, the one he meant, and he looked back at her with the steadiness that had been constant since the first morning in Hargrove's store, and the lamplight was warm and the stove was going and the ranch was quiet outside. "Wallace," she said. "Charlotte," he said. It was the only way they ever needed to begin. On a morning in the early spring of 1888, Charlotte Mercer walked out through the back door of her house with a cup of coffee and stood in the yard in the new light hour before the children were up, looking at the land. The grass was beginning to come back from the winter in the pale green of early growth, and the creek in the distance was running high with snowmelt from the caprock, and the sky above the Llano Estacado was doing what it did in the clear March morning, that particular deep blue that existed only in this specific country. Wallace came out of the barn and saw her standing there and walked across the yard and stood beside her without a word, and she handed him the coffee and he drank from it and handed it back, and they stood in the morning in the easy companionship of people who have been standing beside each other for 10 years and have no intention of stopping. "What are you looking at?" he asked, not because he could not see but because he liked to hear her. "Everything," she said. "All of it." He looked out at the land that was his and hers and had been there since before they were married, the land with the spring and the good grass and the view that was worth looking at. "It is good," he said. "It is very good," she said. The children would be up soon. Thomas at 9 was already developing the habit of early rising that was his father's, and Daniel would be dragged out of sleep by Thomas and arrive at the breakfast table with his hair in every direction, and his shirt on backwards with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has made peace with mornings. Emma would come last, with a decisiveness about her morning that suggested she woke up already decided about things, and was simply waiting for the world to be informed. Charlotte thought about all of this with the specific pleasure of knowing exactly what the next hour would look like: the coffee and the biscuits and the particular morning noise of 3 children in a kitchen, and beyond that the day with its work and its weather and its small ordinary moments that she knew now to pay attention to, because the small ordinary moments were in fact the large extraordinary life. She thought about a woman of 21 on a farm outside San Antonio, restless with something she could not name, packing a trunk to follow her brother to a town she had never seen. She thought about a man who had ridden 3 miles before dawn with a pot of red paint and a too-wide brush and knelt in the dirt beside a water trough, because he could not take another step in any direction without making certain she knew. She thought about the whole town knowing before she did, and Mrs. Prout in the doorway of the post office, and Tommy Wills with his mouth open, and the color that had started at her collar and moved upward, and the ledger she had stared at without seeing, and the decision she had made and the one she had made after that, and all the ones since then. She thought about Saturday evenings and east-facing windows and a garnet ring that was dark red as the paint on a water trough, and the walnut bed in the east-facing room, and the sound of 2 boys and a girl asleep in their beds, and the view of the escarpment at sunset that was still, every single evening, worth stopping for. She put her hand through Wallace's arm and leaned slightly against him, and he adjusted slightly to receive her in the comfortable, unconscious way of long habit, and they stood in the spring morning in front of the life they had built together, and did not say anything at all for a while, because there was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said and acted on and lived. A few years later, when Emma was old enough to walk the 4 miles from the ranch to school in town, she would pass Main Street every day and look at the water trough, the newer one without the painted letters. And sometimes she would stop and look at it for a moment and think about what her mother had told her, about a morning in April before she was born, when a man had knelt in the dirt in the blue-gray hour before dawn and painted a woman's name in letters so large that the whole town could read them, and then gone back to work and waited for the world to wake up and the woman to find out. And she would think about the way her father looked at her mother across the kitchen table in the lamplight. And she would understand. Wallace Mercer had built his 93 acres into something that would outlast him, which was what he had intended. The cattle and the grass and the spring that ran year-round, and the house with the east-facing windows, where the morning light came in on schedule every day without fail. He had built a partnership with the woman who kept his accounts and kept his confidence and had the most accurate gray-green eyes he had ever seen. And that partnership was still, all the years later, the most important thing he had done. Charlotte Hart had found what she had been restless for, which was not a particular place or a particular kind of life, but a particular quality of being known. Of having someone look at you carefully enough to paint your name in red letters large enough for the whole town to read, and then come find you in the afternoon with his hat in his hands, waiting to hear if you had seen it. She had seen it. She had seen all of it. And on a spring morning in 1888, standing in the yard of her ranch with her hand through her husband's arm and the Texas sky enormous above her, and the sound of her children beginning to wake in the house behind her, Charlotte Mercer, who had been Charlotte Hart, felt the whole of it surrounding her like light coming through east-facing windows, clear and warm and steady as a spring that runs year-round. As fixed and faithful as a man who had known long before she did, and had painted it in letters large enough for the world to read, and then come to find her, exactly as she had known he would.